So I just finished Dragon Age the Veilguard, and it was pretty mediocre. We've had quite a history of talking about Dragon Age in the early days of my YouTube career, but I'll save you the trouble of going back to older videos and just tell you that ever since the greatness that was Dragon Age Origins, BioWare has struggled to make a sequel that lives up to it, though the reasons for this change depending on the sequel. Dragon Age 2 was on the right track. It had many memorable moments and characters, but it suffered from a lot of compromises due to the fact that it was crunched out in about 16 months, so there are just too many unrefined low points to ignore. Dragon Age Inquisition was the height of the series' success to many, but not me. The switch to an MMO-like open world just didn't work here, and what could have been a promising story quickly devolves into fighting an unmemorable villain with absolutely no depth or interesting choices to make. But that was 10 years ago, and BioWare is in a very different situation now. It seems like everything that they've done since then has been plagued by high-level mismanagement. Regardless of everything, the game that we got is the game that we got, and you might already know this next part, but Electronic Arts has deemed Dragon Age the Veilguard to be a commercial failure. Without getting too deep into the numbers, this isn't a case of a publisher having expectations that were unreasonably high. Sales within the first 2 months appear to be considerably lower than even the first Dragon Age, and other BioWare releases from the early 2010s. After a decade, the audience that helped propel Inquisition to 12 million lifetime sales just didn't show up for Veilguard. There's no arguing against that point. Now, despite BioWare's flop era, I do think that this is probably the best game that they've released since Inquisition. This isn't as embarrassing or boring as Mass Effect Andromeda or Anthem, but it's not a return to form despite what some reviewers have said. We'll start with the positives. The game's visuals are pretty nice for the most part. Locations like Tevinter and the Deep Roads, where you can most clearly see callbacks to the visuals from the older games, really stand out, and there's some more natural environments that also look quite impressive. There are some designs for enemies and locations like the ancient elven ruins that I think look a little more generic or lose that Dragon Age style, but the graphics are overall a huge improvement compared to the first 2 games in the series. While not terrible, the technology used for cutscene animations doesn't feel like it's gotten any improvements since the Mass Effect days, and so sometimes what looked good a decade ago can appear stiff or awkward. There are also some times where the game struggles between realism and stylization, particularly in regard to how shadows or skin appear. Sometimes flesh just looks flat, with no definition. It comes off a little uncanny. If this was on purpose, it really wasn't needed because the game already has style in places where it counts. The main element that shines in this game is the combat system. While it might be sad to see them pretty much throw away the old combat, it's easily the best thing going on in Veilguard. At a glance, BioWare took as many design cues as they could from Mass Effect and applied them to a melee-oriented game instead. I'm sure you might be reminded of other modern action games as well, and it results in your character having a moveset with a healthy amount of variety. It's funny, we were talking about Final Fantasy XVI a while ago and my issues with that game's combat. Somehow Veilguard accidentally addressed pretty much all of my criticisms. You've got light and heavy attacks, both of which can be charged to modify your combos and apply bonus effects, and you can also switch between 1- and 2-handed weapons. Defensive options are also robust with multiple types of dodging, blocking, and parrying enemies. You've even got ranged capabilities by throwing your shield Captain America style. And you're going to need to learn the difference between all of these different techniques if you want to do well in this game. Of course, the powers are the big things that you can do. While some of them still work off of cooldowns like in Mass Effect, many are based on a new resource instead, one that builds up as you do damage or block enemies. You really want to put thought into what powers you want to use and when, so that you can string them into effective combos. Not to mention the actual combo system that you can do with your allies. It's similar to what Mass Effect had. Kind of less depth, honestly. Oh, and there's also an ultimate power that can deal really big damage if that's not enough. And most of what I'm talking about here, that's just the warrior class. There are 2 other classes that you can play as. They function a little bit differently. Each class has an absolutely massive sphere grid of powers and upgrades to work towards. You can respec for free whenever you'd like, but honestly they might have overdone it on the size of this grid, as there's just no way to get most of the upgrades on here, even when you're at the level cap. But I think it's better to have a lot of options than none at all. Overall, I think BioWare was really onto something here, and combat was a lot of fun, at least for the first 10 to 15 hours, because that's when the game ran out of new things to throw at me, and from there, it became an increasingly boring grind. Mass Effect 3 had fantastic enemy design, where you really had to approach each faction and opponent differently, because they had very different tools that they could use against you. But that's not really the case here, and there's not a significant difference between fighting Darkspawn, Venatori, or other monsters. Eventually, enemies will just have loads of health and armor, which makes fighting them a real drag. Unless there was a pit or nearby cliff to dropkick enemies into, I eventually started just running right past opponents unless I absolutely needed to fight them to progress. That's not good. This even applies to some of the dragon battles, which are meant to be awesome set pieces. After you've fought 1 or 2, you've pretty much fought them all, and several of the optional endgame quests involve fighting them, so they become repetitive in the same way. There's also a boss that you fight in the middle of the game that took 3 times longer than it should have to beat. I really couldn't believe how long it was taking, but at least later bosses and the final boss didn't really have those issues. Veilguard is about as long as your average Mass Effect game, as long as you take the time to do the most important side quests, and yet it doesn't really have the stamina to go the distance. The areas that you can explore are thankfully much smaller than Inquisition's, but most of the quests that you do there are still bland and don't feel very satisfying. There's really only one side quest that is worthwhile, and the game makes it quite obvious that you should be doing this. Now, let's get into the story and characters. The short version is that they kinda blew it. Inquisition may have had a cookie-cutter villain, but at least there was only one of them. I wasn't as invested in Solus as BioWare probably wanted me to be, but he had what it took to be the nuanced, interesting antagonist that this game desperately needed, which is why barely an hour in, he's banished to story jail and replaced with 2 other elven gods who are one-dimensional, evil monsters who somehow acquire a massive army to threaten the world in what feels like 5 minutes. Pardon the pun, but the first act of this game is dreadful, and I almost wanted to quit right then and there. The stakes are incredibly high from the beginning, and almost nothing is done to establish why your character, Rook, is in a leadership position and needs to make decisions that affect the fate of multiple realms and organizations. Rather than a build-up to the reveal of Solus's plans and the emergence of these new gods, it all just happens extremely fast, and the stakes never really change. You just accept that the entire world is at risk, and only you can fix it, as if it were a normal Tuesday. The game's pacing is also very poor. You might see a cutscene tease some plot device or antagonist, but then they won't show up for like 15 to 20 hours. It doesn't feel like much of anything significant happens for most of the game either. There's an attempt at a big choice early on, but the logic behind it just isn't there, and it's clear that one option makes a lot more sense than the other, although by the very end of the game it doesn't really matter which one you picked. Things do finally pick up during the very last mission. They delivered on a good final action set piece that takes a lot of cues from Mass Effect in its design, but even this came right after an absolutely awful twist that I hated. It just felt terribly contrived and only felt like it was done because the writers forgot that Solus was supposed to be a villain when he's inevitably let out of his jail cell so that he can be involved in the game's climax, which felt a lot like the very beginning of the game, reinforcing the idea that most of the game's events just feel like a big waste of time. We just went in a big circle. And it's not just the core plot, but the tone and established world of Dragon Age seems to have taken a bit of a hit too. The dark fantasy elements that help Dragon Age stand out are mostly gone with a few exceptions, and they've generally been replaced with Marvel-style heroics. While it is nice to finally travel to regions that we mostly just heard about in older games, there seems to have been a conscious effort to avoid and downplay many elements of the world that you'd think would be a big deal, as several of these served as critical plot points and tensions for the stories in the older games. As important as the Maker, the Chantry, and the Templar Templars were in the previous titles, they're almost never mentioned in this game, even though you travel to countries where the religion should be present. You never see any Tranquil, and I don't even think they're mentioned once. Back in the first Dragon Age game, the Antivan Crows were made out to be pretty brutal, training slaves and orphans to become assassins who control an entire kingdom from the shadows. But here, they're all just sympathetic freedom fighters, and I don't think they even really get into any of that old backstory stuff. Even slavery is barely mentioned in this game, despite how much time you spend in the Tevinter Imperium. All of the brutal societal divisions that were caused by mages deciding they should rule over regular people, those are largely ignored. Instead, all of the problems in Tevinter are being caused by the Venatori cult, and how are these guys even still around? They were just a cult that worshipped the bad guy in Inquisition, and it's been 10 years since you beat all their asses and killed that god. It's bizarre because you spend 99% of this game fighting against evil oppressors, but the methods of oppression that have always provided great tensions for the setting and characters were seemingly not really worth including. While I'm complaining, I might as well say that Red Lyrium was given a pointless retcon that attempts to downplay the negative impact that it had in previous games, even though they only just explained what it was in the last game. The same also goes for a lot of details about the elven gods, despite how important they are in this game. When you're retconning a lot of things that you just explained in the previous game, you might have a problem. And hey, do you remember when only a Grey Warden could kill an archdemon and they had to sacrifice themselves in the process? Because I'm not sure the writers did. These might seem kind of shallow, but the reason that this is so frustrating is because the only trick this game's plot has is that it reveals a lot of hidden truths about the ancient past, and those pretty much shatter most of what we had assumed about the world as we knew it in Dragon Age. There should be massive crises of faiths happening across the world for pretty much everybody, but we never get to see how society reacts to any of this because they decided to remove a lot of those organizations and elements, and there's hardly any NPCs to talk to it about. From a dialogue standpoint, the writing in this game is just not at the level that it needed to be at. I don't think it's absolutely terrible as some have suggested, but it is mostly bland, and there's really so much of it that you need to sit through at times. Any character that's an antagonist is extremely one-dimensional to the point where they might as well be starring in a children's film where the heroes have to save an orphanage. And Rook feels quite dull as a protagonist. You can rarely talk to anyone outside of the party or key cast, and when you do it just doesn't feel like you can really challenge or influence them in a meaningful way. In earlier games, you had a lot of control over your relationship with certain characters, to the point where you could really change their personality, their motivations, or sometimes they might quit or turn on you. But Rook doesn't feel like a leader so much as the team's therapist. Way too many conversations are just framed as you checking up on everybody to make sure that they're comfortable. You just let them vent at you and say something polite in response, regardless of the tone icons on the dialogue wheel and what they might imply. I know there are people who look at the old Mass Effect dialogue wheel as an outdated way of doing conversations, and while I still believe that it has potential and can be used well, this game is not doing it any favors. It feels lazier than it's been in a while. The game's party is also an exercise in blandness. Most of them are not really defined by anything other than their occupation. Darvin is a Grey Warden, and he has a young griffin, and that's basically it. That's his entire character. Lucanus is an assassin, who mostly talks about his hometown and coffee. He also has a demon trapped in his body that was forcibly put there, and it's absolutely nuts how this never really comes into play during the game, even during his personal questline. Harding, Nev, and Balara are similarly boring, but they do get bonus points against them because I found a lot of their voice acting to be extremely grating, and it made me want to avoid using them in combat whenever I could. I think that my favorite party member overall was Emmerich, because while he is mostly defined by being a necromancer, he is a complete subversion of that kind of character. He's kind and polite, and he demonstrates how a form of magic that's almost always depicted as evil can be used by an entire society in a manner that is respectful to the dead and certainly not harmful to the living. It really felt like there was a story worth telling with him, even if it is pretty detached from the rest of the game's events. I wasn't as big on his skeleton sidekick, though. It felt like he existed to sell merch or something. You can have him, or you can have the baby griffin, but you can't have two mascots in the team. It's basic rules. Crossover scenes between different characters also felt very weak. Everyone exists within this very small shell, so they never really connect with one another. and when they do, it just seems contrived. There's a point where two characters suddenly have adversity with one another, and it needs to be resolved before the main story can advance, and there's no clear reason for it. And plus, it just sort of resolves itself without any meaningful development. You compare this to how nuanced and fleshed out characters like Alistair and Morgan were, and how they played off of each other, and the kinds of conflicts that emerged with the party involving Anders or Isabella. There's just nobody here that really holds a candle to what BioWare was doing in the past. There's one more party member who seems to be the focus of 85% of online discussion about the game, and that character is Tash. Tash is significant for BioWare because this is the first time that there's been a party member who undergoes a change in gender identity over the course of the game, initially being referred to as female and becoming non-binary later on. I don't think it's my place to decide if this was good representation or not. I've seen various articles and opinions from trans and non-binary authors who had issues with the way that Tash was written and portrayed, however. I wish I could say that I didn't have issues with this character. If I'm being honest, Tash might be my least favorite party member that has ever been in a BioWare game. This was mostly due to my dislike for the voice acting, I didn't like how it was performed, and I didn't like how Tash was written. Tash reminded me of Grunt from Mass Effect if he had every negative stereotype that was associated with Gen Z and modern youth. The result is a character who feels incredibly anachronistic in a way that doesn't improve anything. Tash is also the only party member that feels like they have a lot going on in their side quests. There's the gender identity elements, of course, which you can talk to them about, but you don't really have any control over that element of their story. They are also struggling with their cultural identity, being torn between their adopted land of Ravain and being a Kunari. And this is an area where you can absolutely influence them by basically telling them to suck it up and pick a culture. And in my opinion, this came off as a little bit racist. I'm not a person of mixed racial or cultural heritage, but I've known enough people who are to know that this is not how having a mixed heritage works. You don't just choose to pick one and ignore the other as if it were a completely binary choice, ironically enough, binary choice. But yeah, that's just not really how it works. I was really hoping that there would be some options to say, you know, Tash, you can absolutely take the things you like about both of these cultures that you experience and use them all to inform who you are. There's no reason why a blending of the two cultures shouldn't be possible, or at least informing that kind of mindset. But unfortunately, the game demands that we force Tash into a very specific cultural box, even though we aren't necessarily qualified to make that decision. It's very strange that the game wants you to be so arbitrary in this aspect of changing Tash's character, but there's absolutely none of that present with the conversations about gender identity. And I'm not saying that I want Rook to be the one who decides their gender identity, I just find this all a little strange. So yeah, that came off as something that was a little offensive to me, but unfortunately it wasn't the only thing. I don't want to harp on this for all that much longer, but the last conversation scene that you can have with Tash as part of completing their whole storyline is something that I saw being discussed online before anything else when the game came out, and I didn't necessarily expect to have a reaction to it in the way that I did. In this scene, Isabella misgenders Tash and immediately starts doing push-ups to try to make up for it. When you ask for elaboration on this, she goes on to explain that this is better than simply apologizing, because when people say they're sorry, they're either lying or they're making it about themselves. So just doing push-ups is the way to go. And the entire time that this is happening, Tash is just sitting there without taking much of a stance, without really saying anything. I didn't like the message that this sent, and the fact that Isabella is doing all of the talking here would make me say that this was some sort of performative activism if it weren't for the fact that the writer of Tash, and indeed the head writer for the entire game, is non-binary. And then I can't help but wonder if these are the sorts of antics going on at the BioWare offices these days, people just doing push-ups at the cubicle. I hope not, because that might be an HR violation. Look, maybe this wasn't a big deal, but it came off as a bad way to wrap up Tash's storyline, with someone else trying to make some sort of big statement on their behalf. Plus, the most offensive part of this whole scene is when someone else starts doing push-ups and Tash tells her to bend her knees, which is not how push-ups work. You don't move your knees while you're doing a push-up. Come on. It's so wild how most of the characters in this game are bland, and then Tash is just this black hole of negativity where I don't have much to say that's positive. I'm sure this was all done out of a desire to be inclusive, and again, I'm not here to judge the entire idea of having a character like this, and whether or not it was well done from that perspective. But I don't necessarily know if it was done in a way that served the greater story of the game all that well, because Tash is yet another character who feels quite disconnected from the rest of the game's events, kind of like Emmerich. I hope that BioWare takes lessons from this in the future regarding how they choose to write these kinds of characters if they're going to continue including them in such a prominent role. This isn't really the first time that there's been an issue with this sort of thing in a BioWare game, but never really to this degree. So if you can't already tell, I have a lot more that I could say about this game in depth, but we're going to start wrapping things up. Veilguard isn't terrible, but it's another mediocre Dragon Age title in a long line of those. Given how bankrupt the game feels narratively, I'm more or less at peace with the idea that this will be the final installment in the series. If you can get it for a cheap price, you might have some fun with the combat, but I can only really suggest it to those who are either relentless superfans or they avoided the old Dragon Age titles. But I have a feeling that whatever superfans remain already purchased this game. BioWare has already lost roughly 50% of its staff as the result of this game's commercial failure. With all due respect, they should be thankful to still remain in business. At these levels, with this budget, gaming is a business, and you can't expect to release 3 failures in a row and expect people to keep giving you money. I suppose Electronic Arts has faith in whatever BioWare is trying to do with Mass Effect 5, but at this point, I'm not sure that a new game would even be worth it since the trilogy wrapped up extremely conclusively. BioWare is a company that I once had tremendous respect for, but now they're starting to feel like an old family member on their deathbed. I just hope whatever comes to pass is relatively painless. We'll leave it at that. Thank you for watching. This video took longer than planned because the script was initially an hour long, and there was just no reason to waste your time like that. Good thing I decided to record all of my own footage though. Maybe it'll come in handy for something later. I hope you're enjoying yourself, and have a pleasant day.